Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward. And freedom will be defended.
It was the day the Earth stood still. A terror attack on the United States of such magnitude that it killed 3,000 people and injured another 6,000. On September the 11th, 2001, a militant Islamist group called Al-Qaeda coordinated 4 suicide attacks on the USA because of their objections to America's international policies. The land of opportunity was shaken and suddenly overcome with uncertainty. America had a new enemy to fight, and the US government made no hesitation in declaring this to the world. The American people had been told they were no longer safe in their own country. Radical extremists were out to get them, and the only viable response to this crime was military action. The war on terror had begun. Immediately after September the 11th, the US Congress passed a new law, the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Terrorists. This law gave President Bush the authority to target anyone that he thought was connected with the terror attacks. Political expert Noam Chomsky believes that amidst the horror and devastation of September the 11th, the US government saw an opportunity for economic and political growth. After the attack, the Bush administration turned its attention to the Middle East, looking for someone to blame, and one of its first targets was Iraq. The early story is that the USA set foot in Iraq because they feared the Middle East extremists were harboring weapons of mass destruction, and this might lead to another 9/11 disaster. For George Bush, America was at the central front in the war on terror. But when no Iraqi WMDs were found, people grew suspicious. Marjorie Cohn is a well-known professor in international law, and she condemns the United States' behavior during the early noughties. She argues that the USA acted illegally not only in Iraq, but also through its earlier invasion of Afghanistan. In response to the September 2001 attacks, the USA had targeted a 9/11 suspect called the Taliban by starting a controversial war in Afghanistan, where the organization was based. If Cohn's conclusions are correct, that the USA broke international laws in Iraq and Afghanistan, how did these interventions get the go-ahead? Many theorists believe that in the wake of 9/11, the US government nurtured a culture of fear within the American public. Calculated news agendas and rhetoric were plastered across every inch of US media, and suddenly, the USA's reason to invade the Middle East didn't look so extreme after all. What all these media techniques have in common is the shock factor, sensationalist language designed to provoke a reaction in its audience. Theorists speculate that in the aftermath of September 11, the US government stockpiled emotive rhetoric and disturbing imagery so that it could scare the nation. The terror state was born. Pictures of suffering on American soil and phrases like weapons of mass destruction, axis of evil, and 9/11 were now commonplace in the news. Suddenly, the USA had a new weapon up its sleeve. Noam Chomsky points the finger at Bush's exploitation of the war on terror, a phrase which was brandished across the media and broadcast panic into every US household. But what might be considered absurd about America's perpetual state of fear is that over the last 20 years, the number of deaths from terrorism has averaged 162 Americans per year, and that's including September 11 in figures. In fact, you're more likely to die drowning in the bathtub or being struck by lightning than you are in a terrorist attack. Naomi Klein is a social activist and believes that in the wake of 9/11, America deliberately manipulated the emotions of its loyal citizens for personal gain. She thinks that the USA's problem was never terrorism, but an epidemic of fear, which was burying itself deep into the American psyche. After America's 2003 invasion, the Iraqi society was completely destroyed, left to die among the ruins of warfare. But it's not all bad news, at least not for the USA. In the aftermath of the Iraq War, America set up shop in Baghdad's international zone. A host of multinational corporations now operate there, and that's including the world's largest oilfield service company, Halliburton. To put it bluntly, America is now profiting from its invasion of Iraq. So what's going on here? Could it be that the US government orchestrated everything post 9/11 so that it could benefit from the Middle East's oil supply? Naomi Klein seems to think so. One reason behind establishing a US terror state could be linked to something that Klein calls disaster capitalism. 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, Klein believes that governments exploit world disasters and the public's disorientation during these shocking times to try to increase their economic control across the world. Using a kind of national shock therapy, whole countries can find themselves in pieces after a supposedly necessary US intervention. And it's the existence of a terror state which validates this kind of US intervention. Iraq is a prime example, but not the only one. In fact, the war against terrorism has been raging since the 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan first used the phrase in reference to affairs going on in Central America and North Africa. Maintaining a climate of public terror for Western personal gain is a tried and tested strategy, and one that we might see in action for a long time to come. The American journalist Glenn Greenwald has made a scary prediction that the war against terrorism might never end. Ever wondered what would have happened if the Cuban terror plot actually took place? Click here to find out with Alternate History Hub.